The moment federal agents surged into Minneapolis, the argument stopped being about a single incident and became a power struggle over who controls the story when Washington collides with a city already on edge. At the center of that collision are Jacob Frey, speaking as the face of a grieving city, and Donald Trump, whose administration is defending federal authority with unmistakable force. What's drawing national attention isn't just what happened on the street, but the fact that even the most basic facts are being argued over in public, in real time. That kind of uncertainty is gasoline in American politics, and everyone involved knows it. The question many people across the country are quietly asking is why this feels less like a search for clarity and more like a race to define the narrative first. From Frey's perspective, Minneapolis isn't a talking point or a headline. It's a city he has to hold together while emotions are raw and trust is fragile. He isn't accusing federal authorities outright, but he's doing something just as provocative, questioning whether an investigation controlled exclusively from Washington can earn public confidence locally. When he pushes back, it's framed as a concern about transparency, not defiance, but the implication is hard to miss. If the process is truly solid, he suggests, it shouldn't be threatened by additional oversight. That line of reasoning resonates in a city where residents have learned to be skeptical of closed-door conclusions. The Trump administration's response follows a very different logic. From that angle, federal agencies represent professionalism, order, and consistency, especially when local politics are seen as emotionally charged. The message coming out of Washington is that the system already has the tools it needs, and outside involvement risks turning a serious inquiry into a political spectacle. To supporters, that sounds like discipline. To critics, it sounds like control. What makes this confrontation so combustible is that both sides insist they're trying to calm things down while actively escalating the disagreement. Frey talks about lowering the temperature even as he publicly challenges federal decisions because silence would look like surrender. Federal officials talk about letting investigations run their course while forcefully defending their own framing of events. Each move is described as responsible. Each move deepens the divide. There's also a sharp contrast in how language is being used. Frey focuses on perception and trust, raising questions about how conclusions will be received, not just what they will be. Trump's orbit leans on definitions and authority, emphasizing rules. One side is speaking to a city that feels watched. The other is speaking to a country that's been told order matters above all else. The underlying issue isn't just jurisdiction, it's credibility. Who do people believe when accounts conflict and emotions are high? Does trust come from proximity to the community, or from distance and supposed neutrality? Those questions don't have easy answers, which is why neither side can afford to back down. In modern American politics, conceding uncertainty is often treated as weakness. There's a familiar pattern here that goes far beyond Minneapolis. Local leaders argue they're left dealing with the real-world fallout, the vigils, the anger, the fear. Federal leaders argue they're protecting the broader system and preventing chaos. Both claims can be true at the same time, and that's what makes the standoff so hard to resolve. Instead of clarity, the public gets competing versions of responsibility. Trump's presence looms even when he isn't speaking directly, because his approach to power has always been about drawing firm lines. Supporters see consistency in that, a refusal to bend under pressure. Opponents see a pattern of dismissing local concerns as obstacles. Frey, caught between those forces, is trying to assert local legitimacy without openly challenging federal authority. It's a narrow path, and every step is being watched. What keeps this story alive is the sense that something larger is being tested, Not just an investigation, but the relationship between cities and Washington when trust is already thin. People aren't just waiting for findings. They're watching how those findings are handled, who delivers them, and who is allowed in the room. In a country already divided over power and accountability, those details matter as much as any final conclusion. And that's why this confrontation refuses to fade quietly, because it speaks to a question many Americans are still wrestling with. When the federal government shows up in force, who really gets to tell the truth? The tension keeps building because neither side can afford to let the other define what normal looks like in this moment. For the mayor, normal means local voices matter, especially when a community is already questioning whether the systems meant to protect it are actually listening. For the Trump administration, normal means federal authority operates without being second-guessed by City Hall or state agencies. Those two definitions don't overlap, and the gap between them is where suspicion grows. Every statement, no matter how carefully phrased, is now interpreted through that lens. As the investigation moves forward, the disagreement has shifted from what happened to how the process itself is being handled. Frey's argument isn't that federal investigators are incapable, but that exclusivity breeds doubt in a city where doubt is already widespread. He's essentially asking whether credibility can exist without shared ownership. That question hits a nerve because it suggests that trust isn't automatic anymore, even when institutions insist it should be. In today's political climate, that alone is enough to spark backlash. On the other side, administration officials frame the mayor's concerns as unnecessary complications. From their view, adding more agencies risks leaks, mixed messaging, and politicization. They see a single chain of command as a safeguard, not a threat. The problem is that what feels like order to one audience can feel like exclusion to another. And exclusion, especially in a moment of grief, tends to amplify anger rather than reduce it. What's striking is how quickly this disagreement became symbolic. Minneapolis is no longer just a city dealing with a tragic event. It's a stand-in for a national argument about power. Supporters of the administration see this as a test of whether federal law enforcement can do its job without being undermined. Supporters of the mayor see it as a test of whether local democracy still has a voice when Washington steps in. Both sides believe the stakes are bigger than this one case, which is why compromise feels unlikely. The language coming from Washington emphasizes patience and professionalism, but it's paired with confidence that sounds final. That confidence raises eyebrows because conclusions appear to be forming before all questions have been publicly answered. Frey doesn't accuse anyone of bad faith, but he points out that perception matters just as much as intent. If people believe the outcome is predetermined, even a thorough investigation won't restore trust. That's the paradox he's trying to highlight without directly challenging federal authority. There's also a political undercurrent that no one is naming out loud, but everyone recognizes. This confrontation fits neatly into broader debates about immigration enforcement, federal reach, and local resistance. Even if officials insist this case stands alone, it's impossible to separate it from that larger context. Viewers across the country aren't just evaluating facts. They're filtering them through their existing beliefs. That reality makes neutral ground almost impossible to find. The mayor's critics argue that his public statements risk inflaming tensions he claims to want to reduce. They suggest that airing doubts before an investigation concludes only feeds speculation. Frey counters implicitly that silence would be interpreted as acceptance, and acceptance would erode his credibility at home. He's walking a tightrope between appearing responsible and appearing complicit. In a media environment that rewards strong takes, that balance is hard to maintain. Meanwhile, the administration's defenders argue that discipline and restraint are being misread as secrecy. They emphasize experience, procedure, and chain of custody as reasons to trust the process. From that perspective, the mayor's demands look emotional rather than practical. But emotion is exactly what defines moments like this, whether leaders acknowledge it or not. Ignoring that emotional reality doesn't make it disappear. As days pass, the focus shifts to what hasn't been released rather than what has. People speculate about reports, timelines, and evidence without clear confirmation. Each delay fuels new theories, some reasonable, others less so. That environment benefits no one, but it thrives in the absence of shared information. The longer the gap lasts, the harder it becomes to close. This is where the conflict between Frey and Trump becomes less about personalities and more about governing philosophy. One side believes legitimacy flows upward from institutions. The other believes legitimacy flows outward from communities. Both philosophies have deep roots in American history. They also collide whenever trust breaks down. For many Americans watching from afar, the details of Minneapolis matter less than what the situation represents. They see a familiar pattern of escalation, defense, and counter-defense. They wonder whether lessons from past federal-local clashes were learned or simply repeated. The sense of déjà vu is hard to ignore. It raises the uncomfortable question of whether the system is capable of adapting at all. There's also the issue of timing. This confrontation is unfolding in a politically charged season where every move is scrutinized for motive. Statements that might once have been routine are now dissected for hidden meaning. Neither Frey nor the Trump administration can pretend this context doesn't exist. It shapes how every word lands. The mayor's insistence on broader involvement can be read as a call for reassurance rather than rebellion. He's asking for a process that people can believe in, not just one that follows protocol. The administration's insistence on federal control can be read as a call for consistency rather than domination. They want to avoid setting a precedent that weakens centralized authority. Both interpretations are plausible, which is why the argument persists. As the story continues, attention will inevitably turn to outcomes, but outcomes alone won't settle the deeper disagreement. Even a clear conclusion won't erase questions about how that conclusion was reached. Trust, once shaken, isn't restored by findings alone. It requires a process that people feel part of, not subject to. What's unfolding now is less about resolving a single dispute and more about revealing fault lines. Those fault lines run between local experience and federal power. They run between emotion and procedure. They run between the desire for order and the demand for accountability. Minneapolis just happens to be where they're visible right now. For Frey, the risk is political and personal. If residents feel unheard, his leadership will be judged harshly. For the Trump administration, the risk is institutional. If federal authority is seen as dismissive or opaque, skepticism toward enforcement will deepen. Neither side can afford those outcomes, which is why both keep pushing. The unresolved nature of this confrontation is what keeps it in the national conversation. People aren't just waiting for answers. They're watching how power behaves under pressure. They're noting who listens and who insists. They're comparing words with actions. And they're deciding, often quietly, who they trust more. As long as those questions remain open, this story won't settle into the background. It will continue to surface in debates about authority, transparency, and governance. It will be cited as an example by both sides, regardless of how it ends. That's the reality of modern political conflict in America. Once a moment becomes symbolic, it rarely stays contained. As the standoff drags on, what becomes clearer by the day is that neither side is really arguing about a single decision. but about who Americans should instinctively believe when institutions disagree. That question sits at the heart of this conflict, and it explains why statements that sound reasonable in isolation trigger such strong reactions when placed side by side. When Jacob Frey speaks, he's channeling a city that has learned, sometimes painfully, that official assurances don't always translate into felt justice. When Donald Trump and his allies respond, they're invoking a worldview where authority itself is the stabilizing force, and questioning it publicly is seen as corrosive. Those two instincts clash long before any report is released or any conclusion is reached. What complicates matters further is that both sides are speaking to audiences far beyond Minneapolis. Frey isn't just talking to residents standing near memorials, he's talking to mayors in other cities who are watching closely and taking notes. Trump's administration isn't just defending one decision, it's reinforcing a broader message about federal primacy that resonates with supporters nationwide. Every press appearance becomes a signal, not just information. That signaling effect magnifies even small disagreements into national talking points. The public conversation now revolves less around evidence and more around intent. People debate what officials really mean when they say transparency or professionalism. That kind of interpretive politics thrives in an environment where trust is already thin. Once intent becomes the focus, facts struggle to regain center stage. This is how disputes linger long after their original cause fades from view. Frey's insistence on shared oversight can be read as an attempt to anchor the process locally, to keep it grounded in the city's lived reality. He knows that residents aren't parsing legal frameworks. They're responding to how decisions feel and how they're communicated. By raising concerns early, he's trying to show that city leadership isn't passively waiting for answers handed down from afar. That posture carries risk because it invites accusations of grandstanding. But doing nothing carries its own risk, one he clearly believes is greater. From the administration's perspective, however, early skepticism looks like a vote of no confidence. They argue that investigations lose integrity when leaders preemptively question outcomes. To them, the mayor's public doubts threaten to delegitimize any conclusion that doesn't align with local expectations. That fear isn't entirely unfounded in a polarized media environment. Once doubt is seeded, it's hard to uproot. This is where the conflict edges into something more philosophical. Is legitimacy earned through process alone or through participation and visibility? Can an investigation be fair if people don't believe it is? And if belief matters, who is responsible for cultivating it? These questions don't have clean answers, but they define the terrain of this dispute. The back and forth has also revealed how differently risk is calculated at different levels of government. For Frey, the immediate risk is unrest, distrust, and a sense that local voices are being sidelined. For Trump's administration, the risk is precedent, the idea that federal decisions can be diluted by local pressure. Each side is protecting what it sees as its core responsibility. That protection instinct makes flexibility feel like vulnerability. As commentary fills airtime and social feeds, nuance becomes collateral damage. Short clips flatten complex arguments into opposing sound bites. A careful question sounds like an accusation when removed from context. A procedural defense sounds like indifference when stripped of explanation. The medium rewards certainty, even when certainty is premature. There's also a subtle but important shift happening in how authority is discussed. In earlier eras, federal involvement often carried an assumption of neutrality. Today, that assumption is no longer automatic. Past controversies have taught many Americans to question power, regardless of where it comes from. That skepticism colors every reaction to this case. For supporters of the administration, This skepticism feels selective and unfair. They argue that federal agencies are being judged not on their actions, but on political associations. From their view, professionalism is being dismissed because it doesn't align with local sentiment. That resentment fuels a defensive posture that hardens quickly. Once hardened, it resists compromise. Meanwhile, Frey's supporters argue that history justifies caution. They point to moments when official narratives shifted only after sustained pressure. For them, asking questions isn't hostility, it's responsibility. They see the mayor's stance as a signal that local leadership won't defer reflexively. That expectation shapes how his words are received. What's notable is how often both sides use the language of unity while reinforcing division. Everyone claims to want calm, clarity, and trust. Yet, the strategies deployed achieve the opposite effect. This contradiction isn't accidental. It's baked into modern political conflict. Unity is invoked rhetorically, while difference is sharpened tactically. As time passes, the absence of resolution becomes a story in itself. People begin to focus on delays, omissions, and procedural choices. Each unanswered question spawns multiple interpretations. Some are grounded, others speculative. All of them feed engagement. The administration's emphasis on letting the process unfold sounds reasonable, even reassuring to many listeners. But in a climate of suspicion, patience is often mistaken for avoidance. Frey's call for broader involvement sounds inclusive, even democratic, to his audience. But to critics, it sounds like moving the goalposts. Perception turns every move into a Rorschach test. There's an almost inevitable drift toward personalization. Instead of debating structures, people debate motives. Instead of examining systems, they scrutinize character. That shift benefits no one seeking clarity, but it dominates political discourse. Once personalities take over, reconciliation becomes unlikely. For Frey, the challenge is maintaining credibility without escalating rhetoric. He has to show resolve without appearing reckless. Every sentence is calibrated to express concern without accusation. That balancing act is exhausting, and mistakes are magnified. Yet stepping back would be interpreted as retreat. For Trump's administration, the challenge is projecting strength without appearing dismissive. They want to assert authority without inflaming local resentment. That's a difficult needle to thread, especially given Trump's political brand. Strength in that brand often comes from refusing to bend. Refusal, however, can read as rigidity. What many Americans sense, even if they can't articulate it, is that this dispute reflects a deeper anxiety about governance itself. There's a growing feeling that institutions talk past the people they serve. When those institutions clash, the public is left choosing sides rather than understanding processes. That dynamic erodes confidence over time. This case has become another data point in that larger pattern. As coverage continues, attention will likely turn to language used in official findings. Every word will be parsed for tone and implication. Neutral phrasing will be read as evasive by some and responsible by others. Strong phrasing will be read as honest by some and biased by others. There is no universally satisfying outcome. The unresolved tension between local autonomy and federal authority is not new, but it feels sharper now. Technology accelerates reaction and amplifies disagreement. National politics bleeds into local governance almost instantly. Moments that once unfolded quietly now play out on a public stage. Minneapolis is experiencing that reality in real time. What remains to be seen is whether either side can shift the frame without losing face. Is there a way to expand transparency without undermining authority? Is there a way to assert authority without dismissing local trust. Those are leadership tests, not legal ones. They rarely have clear metrics for success. As this chapter continues, the story isn't just about conclusions reached, but about relationships strained. Federal and local cooperation depends on more than statutes. It depends on goodwill. Goodwill is fragile, especially after it's questioned publicly. Rebuilding it requires gestures that go beyond press statements. So far, gestures have been scarce. For viewers across the country, this unfolding conflict serves as a mirror. It reflects their own assumptions about power, trust, and accountability. Some see necessary firmness. Others see troubling inflexibility. Most see a system struggling to speak with one voice. Until there's a shared understanding of not just what happened, but how truth should be established, this story will remain unsettled. Facts may eventually be agreed upon, but belief is harder to secure. Belief depends on process, tone, and inclusion. Those elements are being contested as fiercely as any detail in the case. That is why this confrontation continues to command attention, long after the initial shock has passed. As this conflict stretches on, it starts to reveal something uncomfortable about the current state of American governance, something that goes beyond Minneapolis and well beyond one administration. The longer the disagreement remains unresolved, the more it exposes how fragile confidence has become when different levels of power collide. People are no longer just asking what happened. They are asking who they are supposed to believe when official voices contradict one another. That question alone is enough to keep tensions alive, even in the absence of new information. Silence, delay, or restraint no longer cools situations like this. It sharpens suspicion instead. Jacob Frey continues to frame his position as one rooted in responsibility to the city first. He speaks as someone who understands that trust, once lost, is painfully difficult to rebuild, especially in a place already sensitive to federal involvement. His insistence on broader oversight is less about challenging authority and more about signaling to residents that their skepticism is being acknowledged rather than dismissed. That acknowledgement matters politically and socially because ignoring doubt has become synonymous with ignoring people. In that sense, his stance is as much about perception as it is about process. Donald Trump's shadow over the situation remains unmistakable, even when his voice is indirect. The approach associated with his administration emphasizes decisiveness, hierarchy, and loyalty to centralized institutions. From that perspective, yielding ground to local concerns risks signaling weakness, not cooperation. Strength in that worldview is demonstrated by staying the course and trusting established chains of command. Any deviation invites challenges elsewhere, which is something his political movement has always resisted fiercely. This is why neither side appears willing to soften its position. For Frey, stepping back would look like abandoning the very concerns he raised, undermining his credibility at home. For Trump's camp, expanding oversight would look like conceding that federal authority requires validation from local leaders. Both interpretations carry political costs that neither side wants to pay. So the standoff persists, not because solutions are impossible, but because compromise feels too expensive. As days turn into weeks, the absence of resolution creates its own momentum. Media attention shifts from the event itself to the dispute surrounding it. Commentators speculate about motives, timing, and internal disagreements without concrete evidence. That speculation fills the vacuum left by limited official communication. Once a vacuum exists, it rarely stays empty for long. There is also a growing sense among observers that this conflict reflects a deeper erosion of shared standards. In the past, there was at least an assumption that investigations, regardless of outcome, carried a baseline legitimacy. Today, legitimacy is contested before conclusions are even drafted. That shift places enormous pressure on institutions to prove fairness rather than assume it. Not all institutions are equipped for that burden. Supporters of Frey argue that this skepticism is healthy, even necessary. They see it as a corrective to blind trust, a demand for accountability that institutions should welcome. Supporters of Trump's approach see it as corrosive, weakening confidence in systems that require public cooperation to function. Both sides believe they are defending democracy in their own way. That irony is not lost on anyone paying attention. The rhetoric surrounding the investigation has become a careful dance. Officials choose words that sound firm without sounding final. Critics choose questions that imply concern without making direct accusations. This carefulness is strategic, shaped by the understanding that outright claims can backfire. Ambiguity becomes a tool, even as it frustrates those seeking clarity. As the debate unfolds, the public's role shifts from passive observer to active interpreter. People parse statements, compare timelines, and debate hypotheticals. They draw conclusions, not just from what is said, but from what is omitted. In a fragmented media environment, different audiences emerge with entirely different understandings of the same events. That fragmentation ensures the conflict never fully resolves in a single narrative. There is also an emotional layer that procedural language cannot fully address. Grief and anger don't operate on investigative timelines. Communities don't pause their reactions while reports are compiled. When official processes move slowly, emotional responses move faster to fill the gap. Ignoring that reality only widens the disconnect between institutions and the people they serve. Frey's challenge is navigating that emotional landscape without inflaming it. He must show empathy without appearing to take sides prematurely. Every public appearance becomes a test of tone rather than substance. A single phrase can be amplified, misinterpreted, or weaponized. That risk shapes how cautiously he speaks. On the federal side, the challenge is managing optics while maintaining control. Officials emphasize professionalism and patience, hoping those values resonate with a broader audience. But professionalism can feel distant to people seeking reassurance. Patience can feel dismissive to those demanding answers. That disconnect fuels the perception that federal authority operates above local concern. This dynamic feeds into a broader narrative about distance and power. Washington feels far away to many Americans, both geographically and culturally. When decisions affecting local communities appear to be made exclusively from that distance, resentment grows. Local leaders like Frey tap into that sentiment, intentionally or not. Federal leaders, in turn, bristle at what they see as emotional resistance to necessary authority. As the situation evolves, attention increasingly turns to precedent. Observers ask what this conflict means for future cases in other cities. Will local leaders feel empowered to demand more oversight? Will federal agencies respond by tightening control even further? Each outcome carries implications beyond Minneapolis. There is a sense that both sides are fighting not just over this case, but over future leverage. Who sets the rules for cooperation when tensions rise? Who decides when local input is appropriate and when it is interference? Those questions linger beneath every press statement. They ensure that even minor developments are interpreted strategically. Humor and sarcasm occasionally surface in commentary, offering brief relief from the tension. These moments resonate because they acknowledge the absurdity of watching adults in power argue past one another. Yet even humor is partisan now, read as either incisive or disrespectful depending on the audience. Nothing escapes interpretation. Nothing lands neutrally. As the investigation continues behind closed doors, public patience wears thin. People grow restless with phrases like ongoing review and appropriate channels. Such language, while standard, feels hollow when repeated too often. The longer it's used, the more it sounds like a placeholder rather than a promise. That perception deepens cynicism. The conflict also highlights how differently accountability is understood across political divides. For some, accountability means strict adherence to procedure, regardless of perception. For others, it means openness and shared oversight, even if that complicates procedure. These definitions aren't easily reconciled. They reflect fundamentally different philosophies of governance. As coverage continues, the personalities involved become symbols rather than individuals. Frey represents local resistance and communal trust. Trump represents federal authority and uncompromising leadership. These symbols simplify a complex reality, but they are powerful. They shape how audiences emotionally engage with the story. The risk of this symbolic framing is that it hardens positions further. Once people align with symbols, evidence becomes secondary. Information is filtered through loyalty rather than evaluation. This is how conflicts outlive their original causes. This is how disputes become narratives. What remains uncertain is whether either side can shift course without appearing to concede. Is there space for expanded transparency framed as collaboration rather than correction? Is there space for federal authority to invite local participation without appearing weakened? Such reframing would require political courage. So far, neither side has shown signs of taking that risk. As weeks pass, the story embeds itself into broader conversations about trust in America, trust in institutions, trust in leaders, trust in processes that promise fairness but often feel opaque. Minneapolis becomes a case study rather than an exception. For many Americans watching from afar, the specifics blur together, but the feeling remains. A feeling that systems are strained. A feeling that power is fragmented. A feeling that answers are always just out of reach. That feeling keeps audiences engaged, even when little changes. The longer this confrontation continues, the more it reinforces a familiar pattern. Moments of crisis become arenas for ideological conflict. Local grief becomes national debate. Procedure becomes politics. Resolution becomes secondary to positioning. Eventually, findings will be released and statements will be made. Some will feel vindicated. Others will feel dismissed. Few will feel fully satisfied. That outcome is almost guaranteed, given the expectations already set. What will linger after the headlines fade is not just the conclusion of an investigation, but the memory of how it was handled. Who spoke? Who listened? Who insisted? Who deflected? Those impressions last longer than any report. This is the quiet cost of prolonged conflict between levels of power. Even when resolved on paper, the damage to trust can persist. Rebuilding that trust requires more than declarations of professionalism. It requires visible effort to bridge gaps rather than defend them. So far, such efforts remain elusive. As the story continues to unfold, it remains a mirror for the country's unresolved tensions between authority and accountability, between speed and deliberation, between certainty and doubt. Minneapolis is where those tensions surfaced, but they are not confined there. In the end, what Americans are watching is not just a dispute over an investigation. They are watching how leaders behave when their legitimacy is questioned. They are watching whether power responds with openness or defensiveness. They are watching whether trust is treated as essential or optional. And until those questions are answered in practice, not rhetoric, this story will continue to hold the national gaze.